and I am very excited to be welcoming a special guest on today, Dr. Ron Faucheaux, nonpartisan pollster, political analyst, and publisher of Lunchtime Politics, is Skyping in from New Orleans. So, Dr. Ron, I appreciate your taking the time to talk some politics with us today. How are things in New Orleans as you're expecting some rain?
Well, we've had a pretty good bit of rain the last day or so, and more is expected. It looks like the storm is going further to the west, so hopefully there'll be minimal damage.
Well, we'll hope for the best for you down there. Up here in Rhode Island, we've had quite a rainy spring. I think folks are really happy just to be seeing some sunshine up here. But, we get the chance on occasion to talk with national folks on the national political level and talking about kind of trends in politics. But I really want to start off by talking with folks who might not be aware of your Lunchtime Politics newsletter that goes out sort of bringing folks up to speed daily. And then it's just sort of one of the must-read things that comes across Power Broker's computer screen. So how did you get started with Lunchtime Politics, and how did it evolve?
Well, I actually started with it about 15 years ago, sending out summaries of the polling data that came out basically to a few dozen friends, and it's now expanded to a circulation of over 7,000 people. And a lot of members of Congress and governors and presidential candidates around the country read it on a regular basis.
And how much legwork? I mean, you talk about getting all these polling numbers out. One of the last pollsters that we talked to was John Della Volpe up at Harvard. He had come out with a poll, but polling and trends in polling change constantly. And one of the things that we've talked about with political pundits, and we'll start there, is sort of kind of 2016, the presidential election. Where are things right now with the science of polling? And one of the things, too, is we discussed in the green room, CNN mispredicting the outcome of the special House race in Georgia yesterday. So where are things in the polling world as we stand here in June 2017?
Well, polling is going through a lot of technical changes right now because of the way telephone service has changed.
Mm-hmm.
As telephone use has gone from landlines to cell phones, it makes it much more difficult, much more expensive to conduct a poll, because you have to call people on cell phones as well as landlines. And it used to be a problem of only very young people, but now it's a problem with really the whole population. So to do a good poll costs more money, and a lot of the polls that we see advertised in the media are polls that are done on small budgets.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes they cut corners and they use methodologies that maybe aren't as good as others. But generally speaking, polls do give you a fairly good sense of where things are. In the presidential election, for example, the national polls were measuring the national popular vote, and they determined the polling average at the end of the election showed that they were showing the national popular vote was giving Clinton about a 3.5% lead.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she won the national popular vote by a little over 2%. So it actually wasn't that far off. It was pretty close. In fact, it was closer than it had been in the previous presidential elections. But what happened is that the winner of the popular vote, as we know, didn't win the electoral vote. So then you go to the state polls. And some of the state polls were wrong. But some of the state polls, the problem they had was that they stopped conducting interviews too early.
Okay.
Because clearly the election broke in favor of Trump in the last few days of that election. And some polls just missed it, because a poll is only a picture in time. And it can't predict anything. It can only tell you where things are when it's actually being conducted.
Is it possible, as you said, stopping the interviews? I mean, I'm sure that's from just a workflow standpoint of having to digest and disseminate the information. Is there a way, talking about sort of best practices and maybe lessons learned from 16, is it possible to continue the interviewing up till election day, or is it just not feasible by, again, having to, calculate that data and get it out there?
Well, you certainly can. And this last special election in Georgia yesterday showed you why you may need to. The early votes in Georgia broke for the Democrat by a 10,000 vote margin, but the votes cast on election day broke for the Republican by a 20,000 vote margin. So there was a break at the end of this election in favor of the Republican candidate, and a couple of polls caught that trend and caught it fairly accurately. A couple of polls stopped polling too early and they didn't get the trend.
How important would you say it is, Doctor, for the media to be cognizant, especially of the polls on the local level? You know, there have been one a little while ago concerning governors across the country that was sort of an online opt-in poll that a few pundits, even around here, said, you know, be wary of because of the methodology. How important is it that the media presents to the public just what type of poll it is? Again, we're not the ones out there in the field. I'm not a political scientist. But is it the media's role to even break down just what the poll data might actually be to begin with?
Well, I think the media should make an effort to report only polls that they consider reliable. But having said that, that's easier said than done.
Yes.
Some bad numbers come from good pollsters, just like good numbers come from bad pollsters sometimes. So the media doesn't always know, but they should be careful. And I also think that they should cover polls a little differently. Instead of using polls to proclaim this is what's going to happen in an election a week or two from now, because the polls really can always tell you that, they need to put it in better perspective and better context.
So what's on your plate? You know, we've talked about lunchtime politics. Would you advise folks, again, we're here and live, but once we segment this after, we'll provide the link to your website. You know, would you say political junkies are really the ones that really like to read it, or just anyone interested in national politics?
Well, what we find is that more and more average citizens are becoming political junkies, particularly since the last presidential election. I know a lot of people who tell me they had never followed these types of things on a daily basis before, and now they are. And one thing about following the polls on a daily basis is that you get a really good sense of where the country is moving, not just in terms of how it's going to vote in the next election, but in terms of public views on social issues and business issues and economic issues and international and foreign affairs issues. And it really gives you a sense of what's possible and what the trends are and where they're going.
So what are you keeping an eye on the coming weeks? Obviously, healthcare down there is the big hot topic issue right now. What's on your plate, Dr. Faucheaux?
Well, healthcare is certainly the number one issue at the time. It's an important issue for the people of this country. Congress is in the process of making some major changes. We don't know where that's going to go. And we find that voters are very distrustful. Voters were essentially distrustful of the way Obamacare went down, and they're distrustful of the way the repeal and replacement of Obamacare is being handled. So that's a real interesting issue. We're following it on a daily basis, and we're going to continue to for as long as this issue plays out. Foreign affairs issues are always important. Economic issues, social issues, issues about taxation, infrastructure, forming government. All of these things will come up just like immigration issues will. And when they get hot, you know, the polls come out and they give you a sense of where the voters are, and the politicians are always looking at where the voters are.
Speaking of where the voters are, obviously so many eyes are already turning to 18 to the midterm elections. Here in Rhode Island, we have a gubernatorial election and a mayoral election. But let's talk maybe about the president's polling numbers. And, you know, we heard some chatter from the Hill this week that maybe the GOP might be considering not taking an August recess just because of the lack of action in D.C., with, again, so much time and energy and oxygen being taken up by these investigations. With the president's low polling numbers, I mean, what's your eye to 18 on? Is it a lot of it rest on sort of what Congress does or doesn't accomplish?
Well, it can have a big effect on that. The president is now polling an average job approval of about 39 to 40%, which is frankly the lowest of any president that we've had in modern times. Bill Clinton at this point in his presidency was about the same, but most of the other presidents were in the 50s and 60s and even 70s.
Why was President
that's
Clinton at this level? I don't mean to, you provided a little anecdote here. I don't recollect. Why were his numbers at this level at that point?
Well, he had a kind of a rough start in his presidency, and things seemed to be disorganized. He was focusing on a lot of issues that weren't popular. He was attempting to pass an economic reform bill and tax increases that people didn't like. So his initial polling numbers weren't that good either.
Okay.
Were able to go up over time.
So, as you said, a lot of it rests on, obviously, where we see Congress. Do you think, I mean, just totally anecdotally speaking, again, with those numbers for the president hovering around that 39% level, what do you predict? Does a lot of it rest on what happens with the investigations, even though they might not be something that is a barometer of his performance per se, but do you think that plays a lot into how the public views the president at this time?
Well, you know, any of that could happen. The investigations could flame out, and that would help Trump. They could flare up, and they could be serious threats to the existence of his presidency. Depending upon where things go on issues, particularly handling of health care and the immigration issue, can have a big impact on where his popularity in the Republican Party ratings are by the time of the next election. The thing to keep in mind is in the last election, President Trump received about 46% of the vote. And it's always good, I think, to compare a president's vote in the last election to his current job rating. His current job rating, as we said, is about 39 to 40%, which means that he has lost about 15% of his support base since the last election. For him to ultimately get reelected and for him to lead Republicans in more victories, he's going to have to get that up. We have to keep in mind that even though the Republicans won, these 4 U.S. House special elections, they were all in Republican districts.
Yes.
Democrats were hoping to pick off 1 or 2 because it would have had a dramatic effect. But basically, what it's showing is that the Republicans are essentially holding Republican districts. But on the ballot in November of 2018, you're going to have more than just Republican and Democratic districts at play. You're going to have districts that swing back and forth. And that's where Republicans are going to have to hold on to their seats.
What do you see about the Bernie Sanders effect after 16 moving forward as we look at 18? Here in Rhode Island, Bernie Sanders won, and Hillary Clinton had been the candidate of choice of the governor and sort of the top brass here. Where do you see the Democratic Party going?
Well, I think it's still pretty much where it was in the last election, that you have the party establishment represented sort of by Clinton-Obama type politics, is still essentially in control in most states, but what I would call the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing of the party is contesting a lot of states. They're an extremely powerful force within the Democratic Party, and I think to some extent a growing force. So you're going to see that internal battle work its way through the Democratic Party, and where the Democratic Party ultimately comes out is going to depend on how that battle shapes up.
Well, we're certainly keeping an eye on it here. You know, election fever is heating up here in Rhode Island, again, because of the statewide and the citywide offices that we're looking at. But I appreciate your taking the time to Skype in and talk with folks again about polling on the national level. And any parting thoughts besides encouraging folks to read the lunch and sign up for Lunchtime Politics?
Well, I think the most important thing is for voters to read the news, to watch what the local officials are doing, to read what the candidates are saying they'll do, and to be informed voters, and to really take this process very seriously.
Be informed, and of course, Lunchtime Politics informs folks with Dr. Ron Faucheaux. I appreciate your Skyping in from New Orleans, Doctor. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to talk with you soon, but we appreciate your time up here in Rhode Island.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ron. We'll talk.